The morning sun found her standing at the crossroads, with nothing but shame in her travelling bag and dust on her wedding dress. Evelyn Hayes had believed in promises the way children believe in fairy tales, completely, desperately, until the world proves them wrong. The rejection had come swift as a rattlesnake strike, leaving her family's door slammed shut behind her and the vast emptiness of the frontier stretching ahead like a sentence without end. She clutched the torn hem of her dress, feeling the weight of every whispered judgment from the town that had watched her fall. The road to Willow's End stretched before her like a prayer she didn't know how to say, and somewhere in the distance, a silent man tended his land, unaware that broken things were walking toward his door. The stagecoach driver had looked at her with the kind of pity reserved for wounded animals, his weathered hands gentle as he helped her down at the crossroads outside Willow's End. The coins she pressed into his palm were the last of her dowry money, and she watched the dust cloud of his departure until it became just another smudge against the endless sky. Her wedding dress, once white as fresh snow, now bore the stains of her journey, mud from the boarding house steps where she'd been turned away, tears that had dried into salt maps across the silk bodice, and the red dust of this God-forsaken territory that seemed to mark everything it touched. The sun beat down merciless as a judge's gavel, and she pulled her shawl tighter around shoulders that had grown thin from days of barely eating. In the distance, she could see the outline of buildings that might offer shelter, but her feet felt heavy as stones, weighted down by the knowledge that she had nowhere left to fall. The wind carried the scent of sage and something else. Wood smoke, perhaps, or the promise of a hearth where someone might not ask too many questions about a woman travelling alone in a ruined dress. She walked the dusty main street of Willow's End like a ghost haunting her own funeral, past the general store where curious eyes tracked her movement through grimy windows, past the saloon where men's laughter died as she passed. The town felt forgotten by God and progress alike, its buildings leaning into each other like old men sharing secrets. And she wondered if this was where broken things came to disappear. Her stomach cramped with hunger, but the few coins left in her reticule wouldn't buy much more than a loaf of bread, and she needed to save them for whatever came next. A woman emerged from the boarding house, took one look at Evelyn's appearance, and shook her head before disappearing back inside, the door closing with the finality of a coffin lid. The rejection stung less than it should have. She was growing numb to it, the way a body grows numb to cold when it's been exposed too long. At the end of the street, where the buildings gave way to open land, she could see a narrow path leading toward what looked like a small farmstead, and something in her chest, hope, maybe, or just desperation, pulled her toward it like a moth toward flame. The path wound through scrub brush and wild grass that whispered secrets to the wind, and with each step, the sounds of the town faded behind her until there was nothing but the rhythm of her own breathing and the distant lowing of cattle. Her feet, soft from a life of drawing rooms and tea parties, had begun to blister in her delicate boots, but she pressed on because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering the look in Thomas's eyes when he'd told her he couldn't go through with it. The farmstead appeared gradually, like something emerging from a dream, a modest cabin with smoke rising from its chimney, a barn that had seen better years, but still stood proud against the sky, and fields that stretched toward the horizon in neat, hopeful rows. She could see a figure moving among the crops, bent to some task she couldn't make out from this distance, and her heart began to pound with the terrible uncertainty of what came next. This was it, the end of the road, the last door she could knock on before the wilderness claimed her completely. She smoothed her hair as best she could, tried to brush the worst of the dust from her skirts, and walked toward whatever mercy or judgment awaited her in this place where the world seemed to end. The man straightened as she approached, and she saw immediately that he was not what she had expected, not the grizzled old farmer she had imagined, but someone perhaps 10 years her senior, with dark hair that caught the sunlight and hands that spoke of honest work. He watched her approach without moving, without calling out, and there was something in his stillness that made her step slow, made her suddenly aware of how she must look. A woman in a wedding dress walking out of nowhere like some fever dream. When she was close enough to see his face clearly, she noticed the way his eyes took in her appearance without judgment, without the mixture of curiosity and disdain she had grown accustomed to in town. He stood among his crops like a man who belonged to the land, and she felt like an intruder in this peaceful place, a storm cloud drifting across a clear sky. She opened her mouth to speak, to explain herself, to beg for whatever kindness he might spare, but the words stuck in her throat like thorns. Instead, she simply stood there, swaying slightly on her feet, and waited for him to decide what to do with this broken thing that had wandered into his world. He moved toward her with the careful gait of a man approaching a wounded animal, and she saw something in his expression that she hadn't seen in days. Not pity exactly, but a kind of recognition, as if he understood what it meant to carry wounds that couldn't be seen. When he was close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, he stopped and tilted his head slightly, a question in his gaze that needed no words. She tried again to speak, to explain her presence, but all that came out was a sound, somewhere between a sob and a laugh, the sound of a woman who had reached the absolute end of her rope. He nodded then, as if her silence had told him everything he needed to know, and gestured toward the cabin with a movement so gentle it made her chest ache. She followed him across the yard, past chickens that scattered at their approach, past a well where a bucket hung waiting, past all the small signs of a life lived quietly and with purpose. At the cabin door, he paused and looked at her again, and she saw in his eyes a question that went deeper than words, not just whether she needed shelter, but whether she was ready to accept it from a stranger who offered it without conditions or explanations. The interior of the cabin wrapped around her like an embrace, simple and clean and filled with the kind of peace she had forgotten existed in the world. He gestured to a chair by the fireplace, and she sank into it gratefully, feeling her bones settle for the first time in days. He moved about the small space with quiet efficiency, stoking the fire, filling a kettle with water, cutting thick slices from a loaf of bread that smelled like home and safety. She watched his movements, noting how he seemed to communicate with the very air around him, how his silence felt not like absence, but like a different kind of presence altogether. When he placed a cup of tea in her hands, their fingers brushed for just a moment, and she felt something pass between them, not attraction exactly, but recognition, the way two people who have known loss might recognize each other across a crowded room. She sipped the tea and felt warmth spread through her body for the first time since Thomas had spoken those terrible words, and when she looked up to thank him, she found him watching her with eyes that seemed to hold all the gentleness the world had forgotten how to give. 3 days passed in the cabin like a fever dream of kindness, each morning bringing the soft sounds of Micah moving about his daily tasks, while she lay in the small bed he had given her, listening to the rhythm of a life lived without hurry or harsh words. He had not asked her name, had not pressed for her story, had simply accepted her presence the way the earth accepts rain after a long drought. She found herself watching him through the window as he tended his animals, noting the way he spoke to them, with his hands and his eyes, how the horses seemed to understand his silent language better than most people understood spoken words. There was something about his quietude that made her own silence feel less like failure and more like choice, as if she too could exist in this space between words where meaning lived in gestures and glances. When he brought her meals, he would set them down with a small nod, and she began to understand that this was his way of saying everything that needed to be said, that she was welcome, that she was safe, that she could stay as long as she needed to heal whatever had brought her to his door. The wedding dress hung on a peg by the window, and each day it seemed to fade a little more, becoming less a symbol of her shame and more just a piece of cloth that belonged to someone she used to be. On the fourth morning she woke to find him gone, and a simple dress laid out on the chair beside her bed, worn but clean, the kind of garment a woman might wear to work in a garden or tend to chickens. She held it up to the light streaming through the window and saw that it had been mended in several places with careful, even stitches, and she wondered about the woman who had worn it before her, whether she had been happy in this quiet place. When she emerged from the cabin wearing the borrowed dress, she found Micah by the well, drawing water for the day's tasks, and something in his expression when he saw her made her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't name. He nodded his approval, and she felt a flush of warmth that had nothing to do with the morning sun and everything to do with being seen as something other than a burden or a curiosity. She followed him to the chicken coop, where he showed her how to gather eggs with gentle hands, how to speak to the birds in the soft tones they preferred, and she found herself laughing for the first time since her world had collapsed. A sound that seemed to surprise them both. The work felt good in her hands, purposeful in a way that arranging flowers and pouring tea had never been. And she began to understand why he had chosen this life of simple tasks and honest labor. The days began to blur together in the most beautiful way, each one bringing small discoveries about this man who had taken her in without question or condition. She learned that he rose before dawn to milk the cow, that he sang to his crops in a voice she could feel more than hear, that he carved small figures from wood in the evenings by lamplight. Horses and birds and flowers that seemed to capture something essential about the living world. She found herself anticipating his return from the fields, watching for the moment when he would appear on the horizon like a prayer answered, and she began to understand that what she felt for him was not gratitude alone, but something deeper and more dangerous. He seemed to sense the shift in her attention, the way her eyes followed his movements, and she caught him watching her sometimes with an expression that made her wonder if he too felt the pull of something unnamed growing between them. When their hands brushed as they worked side by side in the garden, when he steadied her as she climbed down from the hayloft, when he smiled at something she had done, these moments began to accumulate like coins in a purse, small treasures she counted and recounted in the quiet hours before sleep. She had come to his door broken and desperate, but somewhere in the rhythm of their shared silence, she was beginning to remember what it felt like to be whole. It was on the seventh day that she found him standing in the meadow beyond the barn, his back to her as he gazed out at something she couldn't see. She approached slowly, not wanting to disturb whatever moment he was having with the land that clearly owned his heart. But when she drew near, he turned and held out his hand to her with a gesture so natural it felt like breathing. In his palm lay a single wildflower, not the cultivated roses she had carried in her wedding bouquet, but something wild and honest, its petals the color of sunrise and its stem still damp with morning dew. He offered it to her without ceremony, without explanation, and she understood that this was his way of saying what words could never capture, that she was valued, that she was seen, that she was worthy of beauty simply because she existed. She took the flower with trembling fingers, and when she looked up into his eyes, she saw reflected there all the tenderness she had thought was lost to her forever. The flower was small and would fade by evening, but the gesture would live in her heart like a seed, planted in fertile ground, growing into something that might in time bloom into love. In that moment, standing in the meadow with the morning light painting everything gold, she felt the last of her old life fall away like a discarded skin. And she knew that whatever came next, she would face it, not as the woman who had been rejected and cast out, but as someone new, someone who had learned that the most profound words were often spoken in silence. The afternoon brought clouds that gathered like dark thoughts on the horizon, and they worked together to bring in the laundry before the rain could claim it. She found herself moving in harmony with him, anticipating his needs, understanding his gestures as if they shared a language older than words, and she wondered if this was what marriage was supposed to feel like. Not the grand passion she had imagined with Thomas, but this quiet understanding, this sense of being perfectly matched to another soul. When the first drops began to fall, they ran for the cabin, laughing like children, and she realized that she had not thought of her former life, her former fiancé, her former family, for hours at a time. The rain drummed against the roof as they sat by the fire, and she watched him carve another small figure, this one a woman in a simple dress, her face turned toward the sky, as if she were listening for something only she could hear. When he finished, he placed it on the mantel beside the others, and she understood that this was how he made sense of the world, by capturing its essence in wood and keeping it close. She wanted to tell him that he had captured something essential about her too, that in his silence he had heard her more clearly than anyone ever had, but the words felt too small for what was growing between them. Instead, she reached for his hand, and when he didn't pull away, she knew that some conversations were too important for words. The third morning brought rain that drummed against the cabin roof like impatient fingers, and Evelyn woke to find Micah already gone. Through the window, she watched him moving between the barn and the chicken coop, his shoulders hunched against the downpour, his boots splashing through puddles that reflected the grey sky like broken mirrors. There was something beautiful about his persistence, the way he tended to his animals, regardless of weather or comfort, and she found herself studying the deliberate grace of his movements. When he paused to stroke the neck of his old mare, speaking to her in that silent language only they understood, Evelyn felt a strange tightness in her chest, not the familiar ache of loneliness, but something warmer and more dangerous. She had been preparing to leave for 3 days now, folding and refolding her few belongings, rehearsing words of gratitude that felt inadequate for what he had given her. But each time she reached for her traveling bag, something held her back. The way he left wildflowers on the kitchen table each morning, the careful distance he maintained that somehow felt more intimate than any embrace she had ever known. The growing certainty that leaving this place would be like tearing away a part of herself she was only just beginning to discover. The rain continued its relentless percussion, and she realized she was no longer listening for it to stop, but hoping it would continue, giving her one more day, one more excuse to remain in this sanctuary where silence spoke louder than all the empty promises that had brought her here. When Micah finally returned, soaked through and shivering, she had coffee waiting and a fire crackling in the hearth. He paused in the doorway, water dripping from his hair, his eyes finding hers with that same startled recognition she had seen that first night, as if he, too, was surprised by the rightness of this domestic tableau. Without thinking, she moved toward him with a towel, and when her fingers accidentally brushed his as she handed it to him, the contact sent electricity through her entire body. He stepped back quickly, not from rejection, but from the same overwhelming awareness that was making her heart race. And in that moment of mutual retreat, she understood that they were both fighting the same impossible battle against hope. The afternoon stretched between them like a held breath, filled with the small rituals of shared space. Him mending a bridle while she attempted to repair a torn seam in her dress, both of them hyper-aware of every movement, every glance, every moment when their eyes met across the small room. She found herself memorizing the way his hands worked the leather, strong and sure and infinitely gentle, imagining what those hands might feel like against her skin, then immediately pushing the thought away as too dangerous, too presumptuous. But when she looked up to find him watching her with an intensity that made her cheeks burn, she knew her thoughts were written clearly across her face, and that he was reading them with the same desperate hunger she felt building in her own chest. As evening approached, the rain finally began to ease, and with it came the unspoken understanding that tomorrow would bring decisions that could no longer be postponed. They prepared dinner together in a silence that felt both comfortable and charged, their movements around the small kitchen creating an accidental choreography of near misses and brief contacts that left them both breathless. When she accidentally dropped a spoon and they both bent to retrieve it, their faces came so close she could feel his breath against her cheek, could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could almost taste the question that hung between them like ripe fruit waiting to be plucked. They straightened slowly, the spoon forgotten on the floor, and for a moment that lasted an eternity. She thought he might kiss her, thought she might finally understand what it meant to be wanted rather than merely tolerated. But instead, he stepped away and began setting the table with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly, and she knew that whatever was happening between them was as terrifying for him as it was for her. This unexpected tenderness that threatened to undo all the careful walls they had built around their wounded hearts. As they sat down to eat, the silence between them had transformed into something electric and alive, filled with all the words they couldn't say and all the promises they were afraid to make, and Evelyn realized that she was no longer the same woman who had arrived here broken and desperate, but someone entirely new. Someone who was learning that love might not announce itself with grand gestures and pretty speeches, but with the quiet offering of shelter, the patient tending of wounds, and the revolutionary act of seeing another person's worth when the whole world had declared them worthless. Dawn broke clear and merciless, washing the world in golden light that made hiding impossible, and Evelyn knew that the reckoning she had been postponing could wait no longer. She found Micah in the garden behind the cabin, kneeling among the vegetables with dirt under his fingernails and morning dew darkening the knees of his work pants, and the sight of him there, so solid and real and beautifully ordinary, made her chest tight with an emotion she was afraid to name. He looked up when her shadow fell across the tomato plants, and the smile that spread across his face was like sunrise after the longest night, warm and wondering and completely unguarded. And she knew in that moment that whatever happened next, she would carry the memory of that smile with her for the rest of her life. She had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times, had practiced explaining why she needed to leave, why staying would be unfair to both of them, why accepting his kindness any longer would be taking advantage of his generous heart. But when she opened her mouth to speak, what came out instead was a confession that surprised them both. "I don't know how to be the kind of woman who deserves this." Her voice broke on the last word, and she gestured helplessly at the garden, the cabin, the careful sanctuary he had created not just for her, but around her, and she saw understanding dawn in his eyes like recognition of a shared wound. He rose slowly, brushing dirt from his hands, and moved toward her with the same careful deliberation she had come to associate with all his gestures, as if he understood that sudden movements might shatter whatever fragile thing was growing between them. When he reached her, he didn't speak, couldn't speak, but instead cupped her face in his work-roughened hands with a tenderness that made her knees weak, his thumbs brushing away tears she didn't realize she was crying. His eyes held hers with an intensity that felt like a conversation, like an argument, like a prayer all at once, and she could read in them everything he couldn't say. That worth wasn't something to be earned, but something to be recognized. That she had been deserving of love and kindness long before she stumbled into his world. That her previous pain didn't disqualify her from future joy, but made her more precious for having survived it. The morning air hung still around them, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what they would choose, what they would risk, what they would dare to hope for in the face of all their accumulated disappointments. "I was engaged," she whispered, the words falling between them like stones into still water, creating ripples that would change everything. 3 days before the wedding, He decided I wasn't enough, said I was too quiet, too serious, that I would never make him happy the way a wife should. The confession tasted bitter in her mouth, but also strangely liberating, like lancing a wound that had been festering in darkness. Micah's hands never left her face, but she felt his body tense, saw something fierce and protective flash in his eyes, and realized that her pain had become his pain, that her humiliation had awakened something primal and defensive in this gentle man who had never spoken a harsh word to anyone. My family agreed with him, she continued, the words coming faster now like water through a broken dam. Said I had brought shame on them, that I should be grateful anyone had wanted me at all, that I was foolish to expect more than I deserved. The silence that followed was different from all the others they had shared, not comfortable or charged, but heavy with the weight of injustice, with the fury of a man who couldn't speak his rage, but whose entire body vibrated with it. When he finally moved, it was to pull her against his chest, his arms wrapping around her with a fierceness that spoke louder than any words of comfort. And she felt something inside her chest crack open, not breaking, but blooming, like a flower that had been waiting its whole life for the right soil, the right light, the right tender care. Against his shoulder, she breathed in the scent of earth and honest work, and something indefinably masculine that made her feel safe in a way she had never experienced. And she understood that this was what it meant to be held, not as an obligation or a convenience, but as something precious and worth protecting. When they finally separated, his hands moved to sign something she didn't understand, his fingers forming shapes that looked like poetry in motion, and she shook her head helplessly, wishing she could read this language that seemed to flow from his heart directly through his hands. But then he smiled, that same sunrise smile that had undone her in the garden, and pointed to himself, then to her, then made a gesture that looked like two things growing together, intertwining, becoming stronger than either could be alone. She didn't need to understand sign language to read the question in his eyes, the hope and fear and desperate longing that mirrored her own. And when she nodded, when she reached for his hands and held them against her heart, she felt the last of her carefully constructed defenses crumble like walls that had outlived their purpose. The morning stretched before them, full of possibility and terror, and the revolutionary idea that perhaps they had both been wrong about what they deserved, that perhaps love wasn't something to be earned through perfection, but something to be discovered in the patient tending of each other's wounds, in the daily choice to see beauty where the world saw only brokenness. 3 months later, as autumn painted the world in shades of amber and rust, Evelyn stood in the same garden where everything had changed, her hands now as dirt-stained as Micah's, her heart as rooted in this red earth as the vegetables they had planted together. The woman who had arrived broken and desperate felt like a stranger now, someone she might have known in a dream, and she marveled at how completely a person could be transformed not by grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but by the steady accumulation of small kindnesses, daily choices, and the revolutionary act of being seen and valued exactly as she was. Micah emerged from the barn carrying a basket of eggs, his face lighting up when he saw her, and even after all these weeks, that smile still had the power to stop her breath, to remind her that she was living in a miracle she had never dared to imagine. They had developed their own language over the summer, part sign, part gesture, part intuition, and she had discovered that communication had less to do with words than she had ever realized, that the most important conversations happened in glances across the breakfast table, in hands that found each other during evening walks, in the way he always saved the first ripe tomato for her, and she always made sure his coffee was waiting when he came in from the morning chores. The people in town had been suspicious at first, whispering about the strange woman who had appeared from nowhere to live with the mute farmer. But gradually their curiosity had softened into acceptance, then into something approaching affection as they watched the way Micah's face had changed, how he carried himself differently now, how the loneliness that had clung to him like a second skin had been replaced by something that could only be called contentment. She had written to her family once, a careful letter explaining that she was well and happy, that she had found a place where she belonged, but the response had been swift and cutting. Accusations of shamelessness, predictions of inevitable disaster, demands that she return home and accept the life they had chosen for her. She had read the letter once, then fed it to the fire, watching her mother's disapproval curl into ash and smoke, and felt nothing but relief that she had finally learned the difference between love and control, between acceptance and tolerance, between being wanted and being needed. Micah had found her by the fireplace that evening, had seen the tears on her cheeks and the ashes in the grate, and without a word had pulled her into his arms and held her until the hurt transformed into gratitude for the path that had led her away from people who could only love her conditionally and toward a man who loved her completely. The proposal, when it came, was as quiet and perfect as everything else about their relationship. No grand speeches or elaborate plans, just Micah appearing at her side one evening as she watched the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors, holding out a ring he had carved himself from a piece of oak, his eyes asking the question his voice could never speak. She had said yes before he finished the gesture, had slipped the ring onto her finger and marveled at how perfectly it fit, how right it felt to wear something made by his hands, shaped by his love, offered with the same patient devotion he brought to everything in his life. They had kissed then, soft and sweet and full of promises, and she had tasted her future on his lips, quiet mornings and shared work, children's laughter echoing through the cabin, growing old together in this place where silence was not empty but full, where love was not performed but lived, where two broken people had discovered they could make each other whole. The wedding was small and simple, held in the garden they had tended together, with only a handful of neighbors as witnesses and the pastor from town performing a ceremony that felt more like a blessing than a legal contract. Evelyn wore her mother's dress, altered to fit her new life, her new body that had grown strong from honest work and good food and the daily miracle of being cherished. And when Micah saw her walking toward him through the rows of vegetables they had planted together, the tears in his eyes spoke louder than any vows ever could. They exchanged rings and promises in the golden light of late afternoon, surrounded by the abundance they had created together, and when the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared tasted like coming home, like the end of wandering, like the beginning of everything that mattered. As the guests departed and evening settled over their small celebration, Evelyn found herself alone with her husband. The words still felt new and wonderful in her mind, watching him clean up the remnants of their wedding feast with the same careful attention he brought to everything, and she was overwhelmed by the certainty that this was what happiness looked like. Not fireworks or grand passion, but the quiet satisfaction of choosing each other every day, of building something beautiful and lasting from the raw materials of damaged hearts and stubborn hope. When he finished and came to stand beside her, slipping his arm around her waist and pulling her close, she leaned into his warmth and whispered against his neck, "Thank you for seeing me when I couldn't see myself," and felt his arms tighten around her in response, felt his lips press against her hair in a kiss that was both benediction and promise. The stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, bearing witness to their joy, and Evelyn knew that she had finally found her place in the world, not in the grand plans others had made for her, but in this quiet corner of creation where love grew like wildflowers, unexpected and resilient and more beautiful for having bloomed in unlikely soil.